Farm. We have Colin Kerris with us today. Stephen is presently summoning his psychic spider army to conquer Earthrealm and help publish our new book, which will be on sale in a few days. The 80s and 90s offered us all flavors of the mystical, occult, and psychedelic, and colorful, strobing superhero stories and flashes of adolescent fantasy, mixed with out-of-place adult concepts, prompting me to title my sync book chapter and accompanying blog Saturday Morning Vision Quest. This episode will cover a few of those shows and a few new ones based around odd conspiracies and alien contact. We also may briefly touch on comics, games, movies, and other media related to these licenses, characters, and themes as we weave the giant synchromystic web we've managed to connect between all of these. Thanks for tuning in to the show. So, one of the first things that I noticed when I was watching all the cartoons, one of the first themes that started coming up over and over, and I think it was largely in help to, or helped from the synchromystic community, focusing on this one theme so much in every medium, which was the World Trade Center. But much more interesting to me than just having the towers in some sort of destruction or being destroyed by some kind of villain was when the World Trade Center was used as a kind of ley line tuning fork and some kind of energy drawing device that Shredder in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles utilizes the World Trade Center in the first couple of episodes to sort of, he builds an underground layer, he enters an underground layer with his giant drill machine, if memory serves me correct. And he it opens up a dimensional portal to Dimension X directly under the two towers. So this is reminiscent of the Mario Brothers movie where they drill underneath, there's an underground cavern under New York, and at the end of the film, the two trade centers just fall into nothingness. They just kind of vanish, but they're also destroyed in some way we're to understand. And that the Mario film includes so many different stills and images and ideas that relate to, well, Koopa is kind of like Biff from Back to the Future, and Biff uses Trump Tower and becomes a president or whatever, and Koopa is running for president, and his signs look just like Trump's. His tie looks just like Trump's. There's all kind of weird Trump crossover. So whatever 9/11 has to do with Trump being president now and why they were trying to, or whatever message was coming through telepathically or some other way into the Ninja Turtles and Mario is very bizarre and very similar. But if we just get into the idea of stargates and portals, we see this over and over and over again in Half-Life and Wolfenstein. It's all kind of the same story. In Hellboy, there's a lot of Nazi occultism or secret U.S. military underground operations like the Dulce base, the way it's portrayed in Half-Life. And these identical different portals and weird Lovecraftian voids and dimensions that they lead to. So just getting kind of moving into just to stay on the World Trade Center, Gargoyles also uses the towers to open up a portal. There's an Illuminati society in that cartoon. And Conan the Barbarian, that actually leads us into the next bit of topics, which is ley line possession, or just the utilization of ley lines and pyramid powers. Colin, did you have anything to say about the World Trade Center, or can we move right to ley lines and portals?
Oh, I mean that's kind of a broad one, but I mean I'm sort of thinking broadly, looking at a lot of these cartoons and running from like the 80s through into the 90s and even into the 2000s. I mean, a lot of those shows were coming in the wake of that sort of mid 90s UFO mania that was, I guess, bleeding into popular culture in a number of different ways. And that, yes, intersected with obviously the conspiracy element of Twin Towers appearing, and certainly in a lot of those cartoons, you do see towers and whatever that episode of G.I. Joe was, where one of the early ones where they're reanimate the sort of the Easter Island Moai, and they're walking about and sort of reanimated as sort of living statue golems. So
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
very similar to that Jack Kirby cover where they become
Yes,
humanoids.
yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you were saying?
I mean, yeah, I think what it was moving, especially into the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, I don't know if like, you're thinking more sort of in the wake of 9/11. I feel like a lot of those cartoons, certainly the ones that you've been writing about, started to deal with ufological issues in like a more explicit fashion. I mean, you had like obviously Men in Black, which is as explicit as it gets. That is a show that is just about secret government agencies dealing with alien contact and things like Invasion America and the Bureau of Alien Detectors and Roswell conspiracies. They're all sort of clearly and explicitly circling around that idea of alien contact, and I think most specifically, it's alien contact that is clearly connected to the military and a
Yeah.
recognizably real world military, especially like a US one, as opposed to like the occasionally quite silly and clearly delineated good and evil organizations that you saw in the likes of G.I. Joe and Mask in those sort of 80s iterations of those ones.
Yeah, it was
And
always very. Oh, I'm sorry. Please go on.
no, yeah, I was just going to say I mean, Cobra, I mean, here in the UK, we're just enjoying the apocalypse right now, and our Prime Minister, who regularly consults with Cobra, which is, of course, it's our sort of emergency management group. So Boris Johnson is obviously now Cobra Commander, but I mean, in those cartoons, I mean, Cobra followed the classic sort of 80s cartoon villain plan, which was kind of known as the Skeletor Gambit, which is to keep trying different plots instead of sticking to one that works. But as you pointed out before, I mean, Cobra have a hand in everything really, in terms of parapolitical assault and a sort of everything is connected super conspiracy.
Yeah, the thing that was always the most moving looking at these as an adult and as a researcher into, conspiracy topics and alien related government conspiracies and military, this and that, it was always very strange to me that these ideas sort of a lot of the ideas, not just the fact that we were involving aliens or that villains were doing conspiratorial sort of takeovers, but more so the underground bases, the details of ideas like secret space programs or reptilian shapeshifters, the aliens habitually needing to get the gold out of the Federal Reserve. This is something that happens in some five different cartoons.
Oh
And
yeah.
and really going from the 70s to the 90s, and like you were saying, all far before even something like 9/11. So this was really well, when you're getting the gold out of the Federal Reserve, you're going from 70s cartoons to quite modern ones. But you have really psychedelic shows that get into alien space mummies with floating pyramid UFOs, which is a theme that comes up with Apocalypse and X-Men and in multiple different ancient alien iterations within the cartoons. But then when we're just talking about the conspiracies, it was always so strange to me that the weirdest ideas in a William Cooper book, in perhaps Rick Doty originated information, ideas about things that would be covered on Project Camelot and things that were in the books of Commander X and Val Valerian. This isn't someone who's watched a bunch of History Channel shows on UFOs and aliens, thought it was interesting, and included it in children's programming. This is someone who had a master class, a master curriculum of all of the 80s and 90s naval intelligence and Air Force Office Special Intelligence and CIA related alien conspiracies or deep, exotic, bizarre conspiracies, and then putting that into a curriculum of the shows. So to watch all the shows together, you're going to see disclosure or the idea of a false flag alien invasion being perpetuated by the government, and they show you that the government or the military is using robots and dressing them up like little green men, or any different variation of a way to fake UFOs in the sky, or to fake an alien invasion. This is in more than eight of these shows, but at least G.I. Joe's The Invaders, the show Cops, Men in Black, as you mentioned, where the origin of the false flag invasion starts in the UN building. This is something that comes up over and over in these shows. Roswell Conspiracies, Invasion America, which is Steven Spielberg's version. Leonard Nimoy even voices a general who commands an underground U.S. military base under, I believe, Arizona or something. And that show is complete with star children and all sorts of bizarre alien contactee sort of mythology. Inspector Gadget has an episode titled the exact same as the G.I. Joe alien false flag invasion. So both episodes of G.I. Joe and Inspector Gadget are called The Invaders. Sky Surfer, Strike Force, and Galaxy Rangers all have episodes where it's clear that the government is doing the invading and the tricking of the populace through the media. Then when you move into Ancient Aliens, you get into really interesting stuff like the Star Trek cartoon, How Sharp a Serpent's Tooth, the psychedelic sort of whims and just bizarre art project that the '70s Spider-Woman cartoon was. The ancient Anunnaki kind of tradition carried on in Conan with the shape-shifting reptilians and their portals and so forth, and even Iron Man, where they show that these ancient Asian businessmen actually transform into dragons or another form of shape-shifting reptilian, and they're kind of the leader of the Illuminati, and they also like go to Tibet to go to their ancient place of rest and turn into dragons. Very bizarre. And Brave Star as well, which has a weird Native
Hmm.
American bit of business woven into all the alien business. And so there's separate shows that have secret societies. There's certain shows that have secret societies that only deal in aliens, which is a theme you mentioned. The newer Ninja Turtles has a guy who's like a Men in Black. His name is Bishop. He's a Man in Black, rather. And he's not like the actual Men in Black, but he dresses all in black and he works for an organization that uses an all-seeing eye on a pyramid and its underground base doors and hybrid gray alien projects housed within and so forth. So it gets very, very bizarre. Um, was there
Yes.
anything over on your side of the pond that we wouldn't have known about over here that got into contactees and children and aliens and things like that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually because I was looking at all these shows and they are pretty much all American made shows, or they are a few Canadian ones as well. But yeah, I was trying to think of like British shows. British shows tended to be a bit more genteel. They weren't quite, obviously married to that concept of a US military industrial complex.
Right.
They didn't seem to be aimed at pushing any sort of an excessive militarism or any sort of a casual imperialism. But I don't know about British shows. There was a weird sort of stop motion animated kids show in the early 80s called Pigeon Street, which was just a sort of humorous little show about people living on a street. And there was one episode which stuck in my head completely because one of the characters sees a UFO. No, they don't exactly see a UFO. This is on YouTube, and they sing a little song, which is "What was that light in the sky?" and something like "Why was it ever there? Why?" And I had this song stuck in my head for like about 25 years, and I thought, did I imagine that I just had this notion about them looking up in the sky at this strange light? And there was nothing UFO related about this show. It was just one episode they saw a UFO, and there wasn't really any explanation of it. I
What
mean,
was really
I've
strange to me was when I was reading Silver Screen Saucers, which
like,
is Robbie Graham's book about Hollywood's influence on all kinds of shows and movies. What really blew me away was not only are the big Hollywood movies like Independence Day or the Transformers or Battleship, where the idea is based around aliens, not only does the military have so much influence and lend their battleships to Michael Bay, etc., but shows going all the way back to black and white TV, going all the way back to I Love Lucy, would have a lot of comedy shows or silly cartoons, would have a single episode about a UFO or alien. And
oh
the
yes,
military
yeah, yeah.
intelligence organizations would still, intelligence agencies rather, would still feel the need to go in and change the script and make demands. And it was bizarre to me that just these shows that were going to be a ridiculous, narrative about one character seeing a UFO and the other characters maybe not even believing them. It had to be changed from the point of view of officialdom, or rather that officialdom would be available to look over every single thing being produced in both TV and film, enough to jump in, and infiltrate and change and edit people's ideas whenever they came close to UFOs. So, maybe individual episodes like that. I don't know if non-American ones have that kind of shadowy influence, but surely we know, things like X-Files and I'm trying to remember the show from that time that was very much like X-Files. Um,
Probably Dark Skies you're thinking of,
there you
maybe.
are, sir. They're
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, they both were heavily, heavily changed, influenced, and everything else by intelligence agencies and people, quote unquote,
Oh yeah,
in
it
the
was
know.
Dark Skies, wasn't it? Because that was Bryce Zabel, I think,
Yes, sir. Yeah.
who. Yeah, he could. Didn't he say that the makers of that show were contacted by a number of men in black who would of the show that were fiction were close to the truth, but they offered to give them some advice, but they never took them up on the Men in Black's offer, And then of course
Yeah.
the show was cancelled after 1 year with the intention that it was going to. I mean, I thought that was a great concept, that show. The idea that it started in the 40s with the Roswell crash, and the idea was it was going to run for 5 seasons, and each season would encapsulate a decade, and would conclude in the present day with some sort of a grand revelation, I imagine, about the UFO world. But of course, that never came to fruition because the show was cancelled.
I thought it filled in great gaps where the X-Files maybe just didn't touch something a little more cliche or well known. It was filling in all these little parts of history. And I think it worked as complementary to the X-Files, where the opinion of the day was it was just such a copy that, it should be ashamed of itself. But I felt it was good complementary material, as I feel with Spielberg's cartoon, Invasion America miniseries, as well as Spielberg's other live action miniseries that was where Dakota Fanning really got her start in acting.
Yeah, Taken. Yeah, that was the other
There
one
you
I
go.
was just about to mention. Yeah, that was a really good show. It was quite interesting. That was an interesting one as well because it was quite close to bits of it were actually really close to the Whitley Strieber novel Majestic, which also is yet another fictionalized take on the Roswell crash. As with the 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 Dark Skies series,
Yeah,
and certainly in the Dark Skies series, as you said, it did have that thing of dipping into real historical events. As I recall, they made Barney and Betty Hill characters in a certain episode, and I think even Ronald Reagan made a
yeah.
cameo appearance, at least a
They did try to
pre-president version of Ronald Reagan.
they tried to show presidents and intelligence agents and everything. It was a bold, brave attempt at laying down that timeline. Certainly, I was just reminded, thinking back to your side of the pond. There's a single CGI, entirely CGI Doctor Who episode that's a
Ah,
mini
yes.
where they meet not only Native Americans with knowledge of the Sky People, but they meet like insectoid and gray aliens, and they go in the underground military base in sort of Area 51 and all this other stuff that has to do with. I mean, Doctor Who has touched upon the American conspiracy
Yes.
mythology related to aliens many times, but this CGI thing just it never leaves those concepts. It's very interesting.
Yeah, so that was in 2009. I think because Doctor Who was on a brief break, they decided to do a sort of an animated episode, which I don't think it's a great episode, but it does very much go straight down the line of having actual grey aliens in it, which, strangely enough, Doctor Who has never really explored before. Certainly not in the television series. The aliens of Doctor Who tend to be more monsters than anything else, just marauding creatures out to wipe out the human race, and they're more monstrous rather than organized societies. But in
Well,
the
it's kind of like
Dreamland,
the silence is a meeting
well,
between
yes,
Dark City and the Greys or something. But I'm sorry, you were saying?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the silence would be the main example of Doctor Who sort of flirting with the Men in Black and sort of abduction narratives, yeah, and then the missing time stuff.
Yeah.
But going back as well to the cartoons you were just saying there about, certain cartoons that were sort of sponsored by the military or whatever. One that I was looking at was a cartoon called, what was it called? I had a note of it there. It's the Starcom, the U.S. Space Force,
That's a
which
business.
yeah, it's another one. I mean, I think the mid '80s seemed to be this massive boom time for these American cartoons, as you
Yeah.
see, a lot of which were delving into this sort of area. But this Starcom was, I mean, it's interesting because I remember when I was a kid, I was seeing some of these shows that certainly the ones that were on British TV. And a lot of them were made by those sort of animation studios like Deek, I believe it was, which
Yeah, that was
was
after Sunbow, there was Deke, but they basically encompassed most of the shows we're discussing.
yeah, it was Jean Chalopin, I think, was the main guy who was behind a lot of those cartoons.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of those they were, the animation was farmed off to various Japanese and South Korean animation companies. And certainly for me as a kid, that was my first introduction to the sort of the anime style of animation.
Yeah, it
But
was this very weird, like Ken doll version of anime that they just blanketed across all those sort of action series.
But with that Starcom, I mean, I did read that the show was, well, this according to the Wikipedia, it was developed in sort of collaboration with the Young Astronauts Council, and the idea was that it was a show that was to spark the interest of young viewers in NASA.
I was
And
about to
obviously,
tell you that it was the weirdest NASA propaganda. Out of all the
yeah,
shows, that's one I haven't read about, and I just assumed that it was part of a wave of NASA related. It was like around the time that people who claim they were involved in MK Ultra and various super soldier programs. There's a branch of those super soldier programs related to a secret space program or a kind of dream telepathy space program or different skills that actual physical astronauts would need, all mixed into one hodgepodgey confusing thing. And it seems like they were absolutely training. Like if you look at the years of programming in media, we went straight from we're going to need men to go out in the desert and fight, in these different desert conflicts, which is the Gulf War. And then it kind of splintered off from okay, little boys be really into the idea of machine guns and Arnold Schwarzenegger and all this 90s leather jacket motorcycle coolness, but then there'll be a whole branch of you that will just like either be nerdy or really into the idea of space or aliens or whatever. But there was a very wholesome kind of like you're all going to be like NASA, like in a realistic 50 to 75 years from now, where maybe Elon Musk sees us. In the 90s, they were like programming kids, like, okay, half of you are going to grow up and go fight in the Iraq War. Half of you going to grow up and like what? Like be on a space station and flying around like X-Wings. Like what? There was so many different cartoons that focused on colonizing Mars, colonizing the moon, having fights between different species and spaceships and whatever. I know that's a staple of sci-fi, but it was really part of that military programming where these kids say that they were, put through some type of MK Ultra trauma-based mind control program was linked to future space and futurist ideas and whatever. And then the cartoons always seem to reflect this to me. There's actually, I'd like to bring up, because I'm just kind of bringing up the craziness of programming children. There's an episode of the X-Men called No Mutant is an Island. And Cyclops decides to take a vacay and go back to the like the boys' home or the orphans sort of house that he grew up in. And when he does this, one of the kids is being told, the adults are telling Cyclops that this kid is just a bad kid, the kid's explaining very extreme things to Cyclops, and he's trying to take it with a grain of salt and listen more to the adults. And then he has a hunch, and he breaks in and he realizes that there's this underground layer under the orphanage where the children are strapped in Clockwork Orange style and shown videos, political propaganda of the person who will be pushed as president when they grow up and become adults. And this person is repeating subliminal type messages with an American flag strobing in the background or whatever. And of course, Cyclops is horrified and frees the kids and everything. This has to do with a network of orphanages and various children's homes stretching from Mexico, where he has his own sort of home base to do this, and across the US. Mr. Sinister had a bunch of different programs where he would morph into different adult men that claimed to be local philanthropists or whatever that were interested in helping homeless children, homeless kids, and things like that. And it feeds directly into the actual real world mythology of not only the Montauk boys, but the finders, the seekers, these intelligence agency related finding dirty kids in vans, the FBI in the early 90s, half-ass satanic ritual, weird like schooling for kids where whenever a federal agency would find the building, like let's say in Mexico, where they break in and try to help the kids, they would just find, little toys and diapers just lining all the walls and just all sorts of really unkept, horrible things and conditions the children were kept in, but the children were taken by that time. And in the X-Men, it's explained that these type of runaway children grow up in orphanages or whatever were put in different tiers of the super soldier programs, different tiers of ways for an intelligence agency, or let's say like the Triad or some gang, to have the resources to use these children as assassins or any number of other things. And of course, this has a real world reflection as well, if you think about it for long enough. But I did want to move. Wait. First, I wanted to mention that Ben 10, which is a very, very modern show. It's like mid 2000s. I believe it's still on the air. It's one of the shows I really couldn't get into too much because all the new animation, the computer drawn cartoons and the cartoons for the kids of today, I could never really relate to. But Ben 10, I did look around the mythology enough to realize that there's a lot of shape shifting and different hierarchies of aliens and secret government agencies, and there's a term for the type of intelligent agent that deals with the alien problem. And it's very much referring to a few certain real life individuals in the conspiracy realm, like Bob Dean. It's called the Twilight of the Old Boys Network. There's all sorts of cheesy
Mm.
terms for these guys who were like the generation of Jordan Maxwell or William Cooper, but worked with aliens in some capacity, and usually have a very positive, almost hippie-ish kind of Jim Channon message for the public when they do conventions. So these guys are referred to as plumbers in Ben 10, and there's a number of different characters like that. And, people have missing memories of them and all the things you'd suspect. But I did want to move into artificial intelligence, the RFID chip, because I wanted to stay on aliens with something. And when you have more than just the 80s, 90s alien government conspiracy going on, and you have Gnostic ideas and technological ideas like the singularity or chipping people, chipping the populace, whatever. You have all this mixed into one place in the Wildcats cartoon. The aliens are referred to as daemons, spelled Daemons, like a medieval demon, or the interpretation of a being that could have been good or bad, but was invoked in a magical rite, is in the Wildcats a weird, strange, goblin-y alien that possesses human beings by forcing itself through a crevice in the RFID chip that is implanted in the foreheads of human beings. And that's how they possess the populace and create a new world order and all these other things. But if you go back to World War II, there was a X-Men Wildcats comic book crossover where Zealot, and Wolverine were tasked with meeting up, I believe, She was working for her weird intergalactic bounty hunter, all women hunting the Damonites agency, and Wolverine was working for the OSS, I believe. And they kind of meet up and join forces fighting the Nazis and the demons, exactly like it's portrayed in Wolfenstein and Hellboy, mentioned earlier. But then you have stranger shows that just seem to be um, technological sort of propaganda, which is Spider-Man Unlimited. It goes out of their way to have a discussion between the characters about how if you don't have an RFID chip, you can't live in society, you're worthless, you're not tapped into the grid. This idea is echoed in Sonic Underground, and it's the reason for a fight between the very Doctor Who like villain and the Star Wars like He-Man-ish futuristic rebels in Captain Power, which was the first cartoon that was made with a toy where supposedly you could take the toy home and fire the lasers on the little robot guy and they would hit the enemies and you would have a score at the end of the show as to how many bad guys you took down. And then they got in a huge amount of trouble because all these like Christian rights organizations thought that it was militarizing children and making them fascinated with guns, and it was clearly a play of infrared lasers and, people just being hit in the chest and passing out in a fictional world. But that was the kind of thing that was after comic books and video games and anything like it, which was this cartoon Captain Power. And we'll have a Jay Starzinski episode rather soon where we'll talk about Babylon 5 and bring up Captain Power again, probably. But any weird technology ones come up to memory for you, bud?
Well, oh yeah, I mean, I just bounce right back around to most of what you were just talking about there. I mean, in thinking about all of these all of these cartoon shows, I recently started rereading Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was probably an appropriate time to do so given current events. I mean, that's a fictional story that seems to operate as a propaganda tool for like social Darwinism and eugenics, and it presents what you could call an MK Ultra narrative that is applied from birth and presents it as something of a knockabout comedy. And then we come around to those cartoons, and the ideas of using patterning of certain external stimuli to constantly condition or recondition our responses to the world at large. And thinking about these things I used to watch as a kid. I mean, I remember getting up very early in the morning during the 80s and watching a lot of those shows. And as you were saying there, it's only later on you realize quite how weird a lot of those shows were. And you can argue that all art has an agenda or that cartoons are just throwaway entertainment to keep the kids quiet for half an hour or so. I mean, kids' cartoons, I sort of felt looking at certain 80s cartoons, they tended to be either very much extended toy commercials that were, oiling the wheels of capitalism by selling us wheeled vehicles. And like you were saying there about the sort of conditioning, kids to be interested in owning sort of futuristic technology and weapons. And there was also maybe a degree of cultural condition in the shaping of performative gender roles as well, because you could argue a lot of those action shows that we're talking about that were largely, aimed towards young boys, because obviously boys like fighting and violence and shooting. But there was also the girls' cartoons that tended to be a little more, genteel and friendly, stuff like My Little Pony and like. But you know, teaching boys and girls as well to desire, weapons and military tech and almost as a sort of aspirational status thing, and to own those things and possess those things as toys, and like you were saying, was something like GI Joe designed to condition kids into growing up and joining the armed forces, because that sort of thing is, writ large across the modern Transformers movies and all those sort of things. And you have those sort of scenarios where the good guys always win, and no matter how many bad guys are shooting at you at close quarters, there's no chance you're going to get killed, obviously, unless you're a robot or something that doesn't bleed.
Yeah, it was often something that they would have to put in the scripting and explain to the artist so that, GI Joes are dealing with red blue lasers and no one's actually dying. And um it was very strange how it was like even I'm sorry, I was thinking all over the place, but even when girls got something novel and cool for a minute, if it sold well enough, they'd have to catch up on the boys' side. So like one of the greatest examples of that is Polly Pocket, which was, a little toy where a girl could like unfold a little cute face of a girl and it would turn into a whole little house or castle where the girl could play with a play set and other characters. And then, I think it was that month they saw how well they were selling and decided Mighty Max needed to exist. But then from Mighty Max, the sales doing so well with that, it another very bizarre, very independent vision, kind of on its own island, cartoon developed, the Mighty Max cartoon, which is a very strange thing in and of itself. And seemingly there's a lot of real art there and a lot of mythological ideas. And it's very deep and not just to sell toys. But there was whole eras of the toy companies saying, okay, we need 3 more shows that do the same thing Transformer does because we need to sell that
Yeah,
many
yeah.
more. And the guys who were writing something you'd think would be respectable, like a Batman, would be told, look, next week, we don't care what idea you had, we don't care where the story was going. What you're doing next week is you're coming up with a story for a reason that Batman has to glow in the dark in the sewer because we have a glow in the dark sewer satellite Batman. And then it just became so preposterous that the toys no longer made any sense and they were still forcing you get back in there and write season 3 of Street Sharks, and it better be about,
Yeah,
line of toys
yeah,
we've already shown.
yeah, I find that sort of thing really interesting because you had that thing with there was certain cartoon shows were spun off of pre-existing toy lines, or sometimes it would go the other way, and the toy, that the cartoon would exist, and then the toys would be based on the cartoon, and that's why with some of the fandoms of those worlds, especially with stuff like Masters of the Universe, you have and even the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the Transforms, you have divergent continuities. You have the cartoon continuity, and then you have the continuity of the spin-off comic. Yeah, and it was all about going where the money was, right? They're trying to pretty much sell the toys. That was the main agenda, really. And whether
Yeah,
or
and
not,
usually one of them would suck. One of them would have some deep intellectual adult conspiracy material, and one of them would be like halfway in between. So like the action figures were okay to play with, the cartoon is amazing, and the comics are preposterous, or the comics are all written by conspiracy freaks and ex-military intelligence people.
yeah,
The cartoon is for morons, and somebody who was just really creative in a totally separate department decided they had vision with these action figures and they were going to be a whole new type of art and interactive toy.
well, I remember in the UK, I read well, it was called the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles back in our place because ninjas were seen as being dangerous, obviously. But the Turtles comic that I read was not the original comic, which was created by Eastman and Laird, which was meant to just really be a parody of the gritty '80s Frank Miller type Daredevil stuff. But the version
Right.
I read, I only found this out years later on. It was published by Archie Comics, and
Oh,
it
yeah. It
yeah,
had
and it
aliens
was
and
a
everything.
totally
I'm sorry.
yeah it was a totally different continuity from the cartoon. Well, it sort of spun off the cartoon and from the original comics, but it went on a I can't remember who the writer was exactly, but it had a very very strong sort of right on ecological slant, and you had the turtles traveling off and trying to save the rainforest and the whole going back into that idea that they were mutants, right? They had been affected by global pollution, and that
Hmm.
became a big thing that they were traveling around the world trying to stop pollution and industrialization. And that was a series where some grey aliens showed up halfway through and sort of took them away to outer space. And that
So
reminds me of, yeah, but from the Turtles, and another thing I was going to say there was also that thread with certain 80s cartoons that sort of got away from that sort of American imperialism. You had something like the Raccoons, which was a Nirvana cartoon, which came out of Canada, And that was a show that was very much, again, very much hippy dippy, a bunch of almost sort of neo-pagan animals living in the forest, and they're constantly going up against Cedric Sneer, who is this like he's almost like a proto-Trump version, an aardvark Donald Trump. He's this sort of venture capitalist industrialist who's constantly, trying to burn down the forest, but he always gets foiled by these cute little woodland critters.
That reminds me of the show that's it's not the Care Bears, but some sort of little animal creatures are fighting against just some wretched guy that lives in a castle that just does wrong to the forest
I
all the
don't know. I mean,
time.
as with all those, the sort of the militaristic action type shows, there was quite a lot of those sort of very sort of ecologically minded. And again, you could
Mhm.
argue that there was a sort of and often they were focused on family units more so than the military units of the boys' cartoons. I mean, maybe you're thinking of the Get Along Gang or something like that,
I
but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not gonna try to solve that right now because it's not even important. But it's like elements of the Smurfs and Care Bear has been
Yeah,
animated better.
yeah.
We'll do that some other day. But but yeah, it's interesting to see how many different themes, like just in the 90s, ran through all of the toys, but mutations and super soldiers and like eugenics obsessions with building super soldiers with different type of mutations and Nazi doctors of different flavors and different Cobra, you know, Conan type flavors of things that just came. If you watch all the shows over and over, or you watch them all together rather, you realize that there's an episode where they, make a bad version of all the good guys. Their evil clones have to fight.
Yeah, yeah. That
There's
that's an
the alien
absolute
invasion
trope.
episode.
Yeah.
There's the main going after the bad guy episode, but then there's like three episodes where there's an alternate bad guy in just a little mini series. There's in five or at least yeah, at least five or six different shows. There's someone literally trying to take over all the ley lines of the earth by connecting the energy between the pyramids. And I think Cobra is one of the first to do this. Conan probably the second, and Thundercats has a version of it. There's two different X-Men cartoons besides the Apocalypse movie that show the relationship between Apocalypse and the pyramid energy, so to speak. But yeah, themes just come up over and over again, whether they're ancient or, something like super soldiers, which was always happening in present day. It was either a military experiment of some kind on the good guy's side and just some, mutated freak trying to make more bad guys like himself on the bad guy side. I guess I'm thinking more of things that evolved after trying to hybridize like ideas from um, Ninja Turtles and things like that. So like Street Sharks and Dino Saucers and weird
Yeah,
wave
I
of
mean,
Sark. So it was attempting what the first ones did.
yeah, I mean, even with like the action figures of lots of that were spun off of a lot of those cartoons, they always had these augmented versions of the central characters. You had the cyborg version of the lead character, or a version with a special gripping arm, or an additional bit of armor. So it was like, arguably that was just an excuse to sort of milk certain characters and keep re-releasing different versions of different characters to sell them to the kids. But
So yeah.
with regards as
And
well.
oh, I'm sorry. What were you saying?
No, so I was just going to mention another cartoon which I wanted to bring up with relation to the idea of ancient, spiritual sites, was Mysterious Cities of Gold, which that was another one by, I think, by Jean Chalopin and the Deek Company, I think. And that was a kind of a self-contained story. It was kind of probably quite ambitious for its time, in that it told like a complete episodic, complete story over, 60 or 70 odd episodes, I think. And it sort of dealt with, a historical 16th century expedition to the New World with the Spanish conquistadors trying to find El Dorado. Uh, and they eventually, meet the Olmec peoples of antiquity, who, rather than being humans, are actually, these cryptoterrestrial alien types, I don't think they're ever referred to as aliens, but I think it's stated that they're from the lost city of Mu, which again takes us back to the sort of Blavatsky Theosophy Atlantean stuff.
Yeah.
And in Mysterious Cities of Gold, these Olmecs, they live they've been awoken from their cryosleep, and naturally they have highly advanced hidden technology. There's references in it to genetic engineering, and they have nuclear fusion, and they've built all these flying machines, and there's a lot of really clear alien abduction imagery in that series.
Yeah, it's a
And the
visionary series, just the way it looks in general,
Yeah, I mean it's I don't think the alien Olmecs show up till about the last third, but it's up until then it's kind of just a sort of a rip roaring sort of turn of the last century sort of historical adventure until the aliens and the ancient technology comes into it.
Yeah, totally. One of the shows that I was or I left out of my listing for some reason here is in a show that has a little bit of everything, but certainly has your weird alien government episode and your attempt at being another version of the X-Files for kids was the Real Adventures of Johnny Quest that came on Cartoon Network. That was one of the first shows I think where they were experimenting with the actual animation process being CGI, but also experimenting with so-called 3D graphics, like things that looked three-dimensional because they were made with a computer in the 90s when they first started figuring out how to do that. And so there would be little sections. There would be 3D neon Tron motorcycle races, and then sections of just visiting France and learning about some ghost on an island or alien in the White House. That's a really, really great show. If you guys out there have never seen that one, but I'm trying to think more along the older, artsier shows, or more exotic shows you were bringing up there.
Uh well this is this is a Japanese one really. I mean, this is pretty a much more mainstream one really. Which actually predates the Mysterious Cities of Gold series, and I wonder if it wasn't inspired by it. But it's Laputa, the flying island, which was a Hayao Miyazaki movie, which also sort of goes into the sort of Atlantean thing, but it's more Laputa, which was the central flying island, which was a name taken from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. But I mean, that has threads of the Atlantis myth in there, and there's again the ancient anti-grav technology and futuristic robots. I mean, the film itself takes place in this sort of fantastical, sort of pseudo British industrial revolution, but it's in a sort of a nowhere time, and that's another one that has a sort of a arguably a non-militaristic message. And the ancient it's made clear that the ancient Laputans wiped themselves out in an apocalyptic war, and there's a sort of an evil sort of human who's trying to steal the technology for governmental reasons.
Hmm. Yeah, thinking along the ancient alien theme still, and it would be wrong to just do a Saturday morning Vision Quest related episode and not bring up this episode. But when I mentioned Star Trek, How Sharp a Serpent's Tooth, where they meet
Mm-hmm.
Quest and the gods come down and explain we built the pyramids wrong, we've been worshiping them wrong, and they owe us, and Kirk basically just yells at the god like he does in all context where there's a super powerful being, and he's like, you know what, I don't like your philosophy, sir, and we're not going to do that kind of thing. There's also the G.I. Joe episode, The Gods Below, which besides, or maybe in tandem with Brave Star, inspired the Saturday Morning Vision Quest title. And The Gods Below is where the G.I. Joes are taken through the initiation process of an ancient Egyptian initiate to the position of pharaoh or moving into the afterlife. They're a little bit of both, where they kind of move through cosmic space and meet the different Egyptian gods that all, weigh or judge or give them some bit of wisdom. We should probably wrap this guy up and absolutely do a sequel, if not many more cartoon episodes. But is there anything you wanted to say before we roll out, sir?
Oh, yeah. Well, briefly, you were mentioning Brave Star there, and that was you were saying it was interesting how there was that thing of them trying to introduce this sort of laser cannons, and sort of weaponry that you could shoot at your television and stuff like that. Well, that was Captain Power, but I had some of those Brave Star toys, back in the day, when I was little. I remember winning them in a competition, strangely enough. So I had the Brave Star sort of laser gun that you could shoot at the characters, which was very primitive. But
Oh,
I
that's
did
so
not join. I did not wind up joining the military though, so they clearly weren't doing their job. They clearly weren't doing their job right.
Brave Star, much like Galaxy Rangers, has this really cool. Galaxy Rangers, the intro to the show is 1,000 years ago, aliens from a far off place realized that they need to mine the gold to run their super fast physics engine or super fast black hole engine. I don't know. They say a bunch of quantum space nonsense real fast, and then it starts one of these great 80s intro songs, and then by the end of it, you have a redhead dancing on a pentagram using magic firing lasers at the same time. But Galaxy Rangers is a bunch of cowboys in space in the future at the same time, visiting different planets and weird Star Wars kind of adventures. And Brave Star is like that trapped on one planet from the perspective of a Native American shaman sheriff.
Yeah.
But there's magic, and the most interesting, what I was saying was most interesting neon color palette, unlike any of the other shows at that time or to come after, and could only be compared to the kind of color scheme in Aeon Flux or the Max, but is much more exotic. And if you know the Warren Ellis comic, City of Silence, it's that kind of use of neons right against each other, if not just some weird desert backdrop. But anyway, everybody, thank you so much for listening. We had fun with our first cartoon, our first Saturday morning Vision Quest here. Colin Kerris, thank you for being with me, sir. And everybody, have a good night. Bye bye.
Thanks, Frank. Goodbye.